Who here knows what that is? Anybody know what that is? Maybe a hand raise or two or none? Yeah, we got a few hands. Parents especially may know this, and I know our little ones probably know this more than anyone else. So that game right there is Candyland. Now, Candyland was a Fairman favorite board game, especially for me and Audrey growing up. We would play, and we got good at it. Like, we were pretty rambunctious, I would say, when it comes to Candyland. But also, I want to point out, and he's not going to like me very much for doing it, and I don't care. Today's my dad's birthday. So, happy birthday to him. So to tie the two ideas of my dad's birthday and Candyland together, I have a story that coincides with the lesson for today. I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, and I was on a roll with Candyland. Now, for those of you who haven't played Candyland, it's a game of luck. You have your little character. You see here the little gingerbread friend. The blue one is the only one in focus, but there are multiple colors, as you can see behind him. And the idea of this game was you draw a card. And you could have 2 squares, you move 2 squares. You have 1 square, you move 1 square. But sometimes you had special character cards. And these special character cards can move you further down the map and closer to the finish line. It was a race to see who would win. And, I had done well. I had easily defeated my sister in this game multiple times. She was no challenge for me. And so I decided I was going to invite my dad to play. Dad was working on something. He was really busy. So I had a lot of time to myself. I was shuffling through the cards, making sure it was fair, and then I saw it. The specialty card for the character Queen Frostine. Now, in the newest edition of Candyland, we have Princess Frostine, but no. This was Queen Frostine, and you best believe she was as close to the finish line as any other card in the game. And so I was smart. I decided I'm going to just sneak this card right here near the top. And so my dad went first. He drew his card. Maybe it was a single square. Maybe it was double. Just moved a simple space. And I drew, and I had to act super surprised when I got to go all the way to the very end of the board game after 1 draw. He quit playing right then and there, refused to go further, because this wasn't just dumb luck. As much as I tried to pass it off as dumb luck, it just wasn't dumb luck. It was cheating. And the lesson learned from that experience was, you may win if you cheat, but you won't win the right way. Sometimes the way we go about gaining our successes means more than the actual success themselves. And that's a lesson Jesus tries to teach us in Luke chapter 16. There it is listed out for you in all 13 verses of the passage we're reading. Now, if you're like me and you can't read that, well, I'm just going to use my Bible and turn to Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. And I'm going to take this a little bit differently than we did last week. I want to go ahead, read all 13 verses, general idea of the story itself. Then we're going to do some character studies. There are 2 main characters in this story, the steward and the master. And we're going to go in depth on each of these characters. So Luke chapter 16, starting in verse 1. He, being Jesus, said to his disciples, "There was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be a steward.' And the steward said within himself, 'What shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. I am ashamed to beg. I have resolved what to do, that when I am put out to the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses.' So he called every one of his master's debtors to him and said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, 'And how much do you owe?' And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said, 'Take your bill and write 80. So the master committed the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of the world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. He who is faithful in what is least faithful, he who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give you what is your own? No servant can serve 2 masters, for either will he hate the one or love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You You cannot serve God and mammon. So initially, this is the story of a master and a steward. And speaking super generally, the steward has been fired. He didn't do his job the right way. Maybe he was just being lazy and slothful, and it was brought to the master's attention, so he let him go. Rather than accepting his fate and going about trying to find another job, he thinks to himself, how can I provide for myself now? How can I take care of myself now? Well, he wasn't really in a position to find another job. So that was really kind of out of situation. He was too old to really start a new job based off that time frame, but he also couldn't retire either. So he was going to be poor, and he refused to beg, so he chose to call up his master's debtors, and he cut them a deal they just couldn't refuse. And he cut their debts in half, took all the profits for himself. He all but basically stole from his master. In today's world, we call that embezzlement. However, it's important to note that as we head into this lesson, really, there wasn't entirely too much illegal about this. Morally wrong, sure, of course. But the closest commandment we have against that is thou shalt not steal. Now, that's an obvious commandment, but if you live in this time frame, people will try and blur those lines a bit. So legally, there was a little bit of a gray area here where it almost seems like this steward found a loophole, and that might just be why the master was willing to commend the steward rather than try to sue him or punish him in some manner. So do we have any initial questions about the general story of this parable? Okay, well then I have a question for you that I'd like to keep rhetorical that you're just thinking about throughout the lesson. Why is this parable important or applicable? What about it resonates with us in today's world? Now, you can choose to answer vocally. It's really more of a rhetorical question as we go throughout the lesson more in depth. But just be thinking about why it actually applies to us. This is Jesus speaking to tax collectors and disciples back in biblical times. What does that have to do with us in 2022? And how does that make Jesus the master, quote, financial advisor? Well, I think we should start with talking about the steward first. I asked multiple people what the definition of a steward was. Now, I asked that question because I'm no fool. I wouldn't necessarily want all of my biblical knowledge in a Bible class setting to come from a 19-year-old. I get it. I lack the proper qualifications, if you will, to hold a full-time ministry position as of now. So instead, I went and sought out some of the most credible sources I could find. I asked Google. And Google, which is the certified expert on just about everything, answered the definition of a steward with this: a person who looks after the passengers on a ship, aircraft, or train and brings them meals. Well, it's accurate. It's not what I was looking for. And so I kept going a little bit. I asked another certified expert on everything, my dad, and I'll pay for that one later, but it's fine. It's his birthday. My dad, his qualifications are a deacon at the Crossville Church of Christ, and a lot of life experience and wisdom. I've looked up to him tremendously over the years for obvious reasons. I am biased. He says a manager or someone that is entrusted to care for something that is not their own. That's the definition of a steward. I said, okay, Dad, I'm going to buy what you're selling, but I'm also going to move on and maybe buy some other things too. So I asked someone who y'all are more familiar with. I asked Alan. And Alan simply said that a steward is a manager of household duties. I said, that's really cool. He said, do you want to know more about it? I said, sure. Well, he handed me this book by, I referenced him last week, by the late Dr. Wayne Jackson, who wrote in the Parables in Profile, the 1998 edition of that. He says, a steward is one who manages the property of another. And so I took all these definitions, even Google's, and I composed them into one summary definition. This is my definition. Now, notice the credentials. I'm simply but a mere intern here. But basically, a steward is a privileged servant with a detrimental responsibility to their authoritative figure. Now, what Google and Alan both hinted at is an authoritative figure isn't necessary for someone to be a steward. Just because you do your job and you fulfill a role that's needed doesn't mean that you necessarily are working under someone. But it's in the context of what we're studying that this steward was indeed under a master. And so in this context specifically, who was the steward? Well, not a specific person, because this is simply a parable. It's an example story, if you will. But I would invite you to consider that this story is entirely plausible, especially for back then. It's, as we would tell our kids in today's world, it's a realistic fiction kind of thing. It didn't actually happen, but it really could. Allen had more commentary on this specifically. He said a steward is more concerned with the success of the master than himself, or at least he's supposed to be. In this biblical context, the steward we're reading was supposed to be more concerned with the overall success of the master. Why? Well, I think it comes down to a symbiotic relationship. Now, raise your hands if you know what a symbiotic relationship is. Yeah, it kind of has a cool definition below it too, but I think the hippo picture is a better excuse for a definition of a symbiotic relationship than anything else. As you see, we have pictures of hippos just chilling in a river, and on top of them are two birds. Now, these birds, I blank on what actual species of bird they are. They're special because they have the right to sit on top of a hippo and just pick at their skin all day long. I went to the Memphis Zoo. I've actually got to go there a few times. It's a really nice zoo. They have a hippo exhibit. On the outside, they have a little wall with a paw print that shows the texture of hippo skin. It is tough. There's not a lot that can get through there. But maybe if you're really small and you're pesky and you're annoying, like a parasite or a bug of some kind that could hurt the hippo, you can get in the crevices of those skin. Another thing that's really small might be a bird beak. So these birds that are hungry, they get to sit on top of the hippo and pick into their skin and basically eat until they're content. They also receive protection from the hippo because, let's face it, who wants to mess with the hippo? It's a symbiotic relationship. The hippo benefits because he doesn't get any type of infections from the parasites, really, while the bird benefits because he gets a meal and protection. They work together. So in the case of our steward and master, the idea should have been that they were working together to fulfill ultimate success. Now, maybe the levels are more equaled with a hippo and a bird. Clearly, the steward was working underneath the master, but still, the idea is the same, because when there's continual success of the master, what follows is continual success of the steward. Another idea to look at it is maybe take a team. I don't know if you know who those guys are, but they're making a lot of sports headlines lately. They've been the #1 baseball team in the country for almost the entire regular season, and now they're in the playoffs trying to make a push for the College World Series. The idea of a team is quite simply everyone working together for a common goal. So we have another of sorts symbiotic relationship between the master and the steward, where they're trying to work together, fulfilling different roles for success, just like a team would. Now, the question I would pose to you is, what if we had one player on this team, quote, pad their stats, meaning they are trying to maybe be a hero in a game and they're working to make themselves look good, but it backfired and now the entire team has failed. Well, that's not a symbiotic relationship. If anything, it's closer to a parasitic relationship. That's why it's key there at the bottom that the steward here is working to the detriment of the master, or a teammate to the detriment of their own team. They're crucial, they're necessary, they're important, which should say something about the steward himself. Yes, he is a bit older. He can't start another job per se, but that also means he's worked for a while. He should be a trusted figure to the master. After all, this steward specifically was entitled to handling the finances of the master. That's a really important job. So to throw all that away is quite shocking, but again, this is a parable for illustration. But also, on the other hand, it's a very plausible parable. It could genuinely have happened just like this. Now, I would invite you to turn with me to Luke chapter 16, and now we're going to start looking at this more specifically. Luke chapter 16, we'll read the first 4 verses. He also said to his disciples, "There was a certain rich man who had a steward. An accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward.' And the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I have resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he comes up with a plan. He's just been fired from his job, and he's trying to piece together what he's going to do. There are 4 things I want to take away from these first 13 verses in Luke chapter 16. The first one is that this steward himself, he has no recognition, really, of what he's done. As we read through here, we don't have any account in this plausible story that Jesus is told that he's arguing with the master. There's no real idea that he's going back and forth with him. If anything, he immediately goes straight into planning. But what's noticed is he didn't say anything at all. He didn't apologize. He didn't accept responsibility. If anything, his silence was confession enough, because he immediately moved into trying to find a solution. Also notice back, and I believe it was verse 2, maybe it's verse 1. It's verse 1. There's a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So whatever behavior this steward was conducting had to be noticeable, not just by the master, but by someone else willing to report him to the master. This had to be something done almost in a public manner. Maybe he was just simply being lazy, not doing his job. Maybe he was doing something wrong. We don't have those details. What we do know is that whatever he was doing, it was noticeable enough for it to be reported. And there was certainly no recognition of this by the steward himself. But if there's no recognition for it, there's also not going to be any remorse whatsoever. Again, he never apologized for what he did, whatever that may have been, and instead, he just makes plans to try and continue on with his life. Now, I asked a human resources manager who celebrates his birthday today, I asked him, how often does a terminated employee apologize for the behaviors that led to their firing? And I imagine this response would be a consensus among many experts who have been in situations similar to this. He says, rarely. No one is ever accountable. Blame is the first place they go. And we almost see this here, not in a sense that the steward is blaming someone else for his actions, but immediately, right after these first 3 verses, he's already plotting ways, trying to find out a way that he's going to be okay in all of this. But he also shows a sense of entitlement. He says, I'm too old to dig, but I don't want to beg either. He doesn't want to accept the consequences of his actions, so he's looking elsewhere. If anything, he's kind of spreading the blame into whatever future decisions he makes. Let's go ahead and read the next 3 verses. 3. I'm bad at math, y'all. Verse 5. So he, and this is the steward, called every one of his master's debtors to him, and said to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? So he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and write 80. Now, what we have here is a simple example of cause and effect. Last week I asked if anybody had ever taught me in a classroom setting. The answer to that was a resounding yes amongst a large population of y'all, which is kind of weird because I'm teaching this class. It's a different experience for me. But one thing I remember learning in a classroom setting for years on end, especially in elementary school, cause and effect. So let's say the steward here was a slothful steward, and that's why he was fired. He was noticeably not doing his job. The effect of that the steward took advantage of, is that he's going to call up the debts of his former master's debtors. Now, don't worry, he's only going to claim part of the debt. That doesn't really make much of a difference. You see, this steward had something that not a lot of people would have had. He had the trust of the master. Now, he does get let go, but that doesn't mean the connections he's made using that trust have been forgotten. That's why he has the authority to call up these debtors. And when he does, he, being the trusted representative of his master, says, here, you had these debts. I'm going to cut it down to this, just, for good measure. So, of course, any good businessman is going to take him up on this offer. He cuts the debts and they pay him. From a very simple illustration, I put together these 5 silhouettes of these guys. Maybe they're all wearing suits and they have different dollar amounts in the middle of them. Let's just say, for instance, those were the debts that were owed to the master. We have a guy that owes $10, $20, $50, $40, and then $5. Now let's say, just for simple math to keep it easy, what if this steward approaches all the debtors and he says, all right, I just want 1/5 of what you actually owe me, just 1/5. So slash away 80% of what's owed to you. I'm just going to take the rest. Are you good with that? I mean, that's a pretty good deal. I imagine if these people were true businessmen and they were gentlemen at that, they probably were saving up to try and pay off this debt. So they may have already had that amount. So the person who owed $10 in turn only has to pay 2. $20, $4, $50, $10, $40, $8, and the one who owed $5 now simply owes $1. What that does is it gives the steward $25 to play with. That's his money now. It's $25 he's gotten from cutting the debts of the master's debtor. Now what that does to the master is they think the debts are already paid. He gets nothing from it. Nothing. So it's raining. Cool. The steward gets, in this hypothetical situation, $25. The master gets nothing. That's pretty much stealing, especially since you no longer legally have the authority to call up those debts, but they don't know that. So it's kind of strange, is it not? Now, what about the actual profit that would have been? We'll jump into that in just a second. We know that what the steward asked of was 80 measures of wheat and 50 measures of oil. The actual debt was 100 and 100 each. So that's not the exact same math. He didn't ask for 1/5. He asked for the majority of the debt. He just cut off a little bit still. It's the same idea. That was just an illustration. But if you want to get into the actual numbers, it'll look a little bit like that. Now, I don't know how well this is going to fully make sense. So I'm going to take it slow. A denarii back then would be the equivalent of a daily wage, which for that time would be the equivalent of 17 cents. Imagine being able to live off of 17 cents a day. It'd be pretty awesome. That was a denarii for back then. According to Wayne Jackson, by the way, 100 measures of oil would be 800 gallons. That would be enough money to last you through 1,000 days, or 1,000 denarii worth. 100 measures of wheat would get you through 2,500 days, or denarii. So the financial value of the total debt was worth up to 3,500 days of living. 3,500. Without having to work, without having to earn anything, lifting a finger. You'd be just fine for 3,500 days. The steward takes that value and mathematically takes 1,000 denarii off the value total. That's a pretty sweet deal. So now he benefits 2,500 denarii total. So let's do some more math. How much is that valued at today? Well, the initial debt, 3,500 denarii times the current living wage per hour. Let's multiply that wage by 8 hours. And let's just say you work an 8-hour day every day. And let's say for some reason you work 8 hours every single day. Because again, I'm trying to give a hypothetical. That would be 56 hours a week, which is a lot, I recognize, but just work with me here. The total value based off of that in today's money, when doing that math, is $474,320. That's the total debt that in today's money would have hypothetically been owed to the master. But don't worry, because the steward only took $330,800 worth of that, or 70%. That's a huge cut. That's life-changing money. Imagine if all you had to do was call up some friends and you had $330,800 at your disposal. That's life-changing. And the whole point of using a denarii for measurement there is this is how much you need per day. So for 3,500 days, but in the steward's case, 2,500 days, you wouldn't have to lift a finger. You wouldn't have to work. You wouldn't have to beg for money. You would be just fine. But there's a problem with that, and that is he wasn't supposed to do it. There may not have been a law specifically against it at the time, at least. But thou shalt not steal was still very much in effect in this instance. And don't forget, Jesus is talking to his disciples. Or was he? How about we turn to Luke chapter 15 for just a second? Humor me. We'll start in verse 1. Luke chapter 15, verse 1. Then all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to him to hear him. And the Pharisees and scribes complained, saying, This man receives sinners and eats with them. So he spoke this parable to them, saying, and he begins. And he proceeds to speak to this collection of people in parables until we get to chapter 16, verse 1. He also said to his disciples. So now the crowd is getting bigger. We went from tax collectors, sinners, Pharisees, scribes, to now including even his disciples. There's a lot of people listening to him, and we have no reason to believe that those same tax collectors, at the least, still aren't listening whenever he talks about the unjust steward. Now, we know the Bible certainly never discusses tax collectors, right? It's never mentioned. Not a bad thing. Well, that's not the case. In fact, they were known for, in some sense, being greedy. Some might even say corrupt. I wonder, this story about someone taking away $330,800 from their master without them knowing that corruption, I wonder if that resonated with any of the tax collectors in Jesus' audience. I wonder if that application back then could have been made. And if it did, would it have been a slap to the face to the tax collector? Probably. Could it have been a prick to the heart? Possibly. It's a parable to us today. We read that instance and we recognize that that's not exactly how the world works today. But back then, it was real life. He's speaking to people that could be directly influenced by a situation just like the unjust steward and his master. So what's the end result? Legally, the steward may not have done anything wrong. I had a teacher in high school, and I'm not going to mention his name, but we had one exam. We weren't planning to have that exam. It was midterms. But the teacher didn't know he had to have a midterm for this class. That's not really due fault of his own. There was a bad administration that led to this. But while other classes were preparing for their midterms, this teacher just simply didn't expect it for this specific course. So he got an email the day of, said, oh, by the way, you have to give a midterm. He scratched his head and he said, man, what am I going to do? I get into class, ready to take his midterm, and I read question 1. What is your favorite subject in school? So I wrote down my favorite subject. What is one thing you liked about this class? So I wrote down the one thing I liked about this class. Congratulations, you made 100. That's all the midterm was. And he said, yeah, I was just wanting y'all to use your resources. Do whatever you can. Do the best you can on this test. Now, was that a little bit fishy? Yeah. Did I thank him for it? Absolutely. But using your resources, we put that in quotes nowadays, almost as if that's allowed. Use your resources. Branch out a little bit. It's okay if you're just using your resources. You're not stealing. Those debtors, you may be a steward, but they were basically your debtors. That was basically your money. He's just using his resources, right? Well, let me give you a disclaimer. Nowadays, this would be extremely illegal. Very much illegal, in fact. So I don't encourage you calling up anybody who owes you money for some reason, being like, hey, or owes someone else money, being like, hey, I know you owe this person money, but actually give it to me for less. That's very much illegal. Please don't do that. Back then, there was no technical law against it, except for thou shalt not steal, which we know in hindsight to be enough, but maybe not to the audience that Jesus was speaking to. What about the master, though? We spent first 32-ish minutes talking about the steward. Let's talk about the master for a second. Now, once again, he's not a specific person, though this situation is certainly plausible. But if we're going to look at this at base value, we know this master had debtors. The master had debtors. Simple enough. That's kind of the whole point of the story, right? But it tells us something. If you're someone who has people that owe you money, you have some sort of authority or influence over them. Now, you probably had to have some sort of influence over them to begin with in order for them to owe you money or to need something from you. So this was someone who hypothetically would have been very important, maybe authoritative in some way. He had great influence, generally speaking. So let's go ahead and read Luke chapter 16, verses 8 and 9. Let's learn a little bit more about this master. Verse 8, so the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. A lot to digest here. And again, I know it doesn't look the best on the screens. For starters, that kind of shade of green, I'm not going to lie to y'all, it's pretty ugly. But outside of the actual ugly green, the entire slide is kind of hard to read. So if you're following on in your Bible, I promise you it's the same thing, same translation, everything. But in general, there's nothing the master can do to get his money back. He lost it. Again, there's no real legal loophole that he can do to get that money back. He can't call up the debts of his debtors and be like, hey, yeah, by the way, you still owe me this. He just lost the money. But if he's someone of great influence, the question I would then pose to you all is, does that necessarily hurt him? It could. $400,000 in excess is a huge amount of money to lose, right? It's 3,500 days without having to work, basically. But in order to have that much of money owed to you, you had to start out with some influence. So if you're the master and you're willing to fire your steward for mismanagement, you probably would think to yourself that this master knows how to handle his finances in general, that he has an idea of how to control these different things, the influx of money, everything. He has an idea. He has a grip on this. Maybe he's even put together, you might say. So these two debts that he's now lost, does it affect him too much? Well, it may affect his financial value, but you can imagine he knows how to get back up on his feet. And maybe we just look at it this way. Short-term pain, long-term gain, right? The master is probably not just invested in oil and wheat. Now, the story tells us that his debts are called in and that they're paid, but we know his investments and the way he manages his money probably isn't just in those two simple things. And also we can imagine that those aren't the only two people he works with. His wheat guy, if you will, and his oil guy probably aren't the only connections he has. If he's this person of great influence and knowledge, he likely knows how to network. He seems to be like he'll be just fine. How does this work out for the steward, though? Well, it said he would have lasted 2,500 days on that. It's really cool. It's really important. Now, taking the actual value of the money, we did a little bit different math to get here, but it checks out. He should last 9 years, 7 months, and 11 days. Now, that may not exactly turn out to be 2,500 days, but what it does do is it allows us, for when we took that big number back in today's terms, this now applies to us. If we were to have that kind of money, this is how long we would last if we spent the same exact amount every single day. It doesn't account for the unplanned expenses. It doesn't account for the unplanned profits. It simply plans for that amount of money being chipped away at the same rate every day. So we could say potentially, on average, you would last 9 years, 11 days, and 7 months with that amount of money if you spent the same amount every day. Earlier we mentioned the steward was older. That doesn't work in his favor, but he's not old enough yet to retire, and he refuses to beg, which makes this a little bit more interesting. He could choose to dig. If we go back to verse 3, then the steward said within himself, "What shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I've resolved what to do," and then he makes his plan. Well, he could have digged, he could have worked, but he really couldn't. He was already past that prime for starting a new job, and certainly if you're going for a job and you heard that you weren't a trustworthy steward, you're not going to be hired elsewhere. He can't really find a job, so the reward he reaped for himself through this behavior was now he'll have to beg for his money. If anything, it only makes sense to steal this money, right? If you have access to it, why not? In a sense, that's kind of why the master commended him. If you have access to that much money, why not just take it? It's not how it works. We know that. And obviously, the master isn't too fazed by it. But the steward himself, if he did truly choose to take this route, would have lasted 9 years, 7 months, 11 days. That time is up. And then you're right back where you started on average. He wasn't old enough to retire. He didn't seem to have any form of savings. And so we can imagine he probably had more life left to live than those simple 9 years, 7 months, and 11 days. If anything, he only seems to be delaying the inevitable instead of accepting the outcome for what it was. That doesn't sound smart to me in the long run. Short-term pain, long-term gain. If he had just done his job, if he'd done what he was supposed to do, he would have that continual influx of money and probably not lose his job for the longest of times until he chose to retire, if he chose to retire. His life was set. He had a place to stay. He had food to eat. He had shelter. He had clothes. He had everything he really could have needed. He just simply didn't appreciate that. I think the comparison's kind of obvious. Let's go ahead and read through the rest of this, and then we'll tie in verses 8 and 9 again. Starting verse 10, "He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful through the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? If you have not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give you what is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." Those tax collectors being mentioned at the start of Luke 15 are really important to this story, because you have people who may seek money in wrongful ways. That's actually the definition of mammon: money sought out in wrongful ways. So Jesus is basically saying to a large group of people composed of disciples and people who despised him that you can't really serve him unless you choose him over your money. More than that, the money you earned wrongfully to people who very plausibly could have wrongfully handled their money. In a sense, he's almost calling them out for the very thing they're guilty of, just using indirect characters in the form of a parable to do so. But what about verses 8 and 9? Because we didn't really address those specifically. So the master commended the unjust steward. We talked about that because he dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. A Google search will take you all kinds of ways with that phrase, sons of light. I've heard ideas that these are the higher-ups of Christians, that these are those who are maybe your televangelists that are well known throughout the world. I've heard all kinds of theories, but that isn't supported by Scripture. The only real comparison we have is light being Jesus. Sons of Jesus, sons of God, Christians. That's the only real conclusion we can make, that Jesus is talking about Christians here. So he's saying basically, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. And he says that in response to the master commending the behavior of the steward, almost to say, that's the world we live in. Nothing's really changed, has it? Jesus knows the state of the world that we're in, and he still is criticizing that, and rightfully so. But I digress, because he proceeds to say you cannot serve him and mammon. You basically have to make a choice. So let's get down to specifics here, because I know you may hear this and you're like, why? You say it's not a crime to do this. Why isn't it? Well, that's because the crime that this is didn't exist. It's embezzlement, at least in Old Testament form of embezzlement written in a New Testament book. Now, what about embezzlement specifically? Well, let's consider the times. In the Greek, that would have been katakhrome. I have no idea how to accurately say that. I'm just copying what the Google Translate thing said. But anyways, that's the closest word in the Greek to the word embezzle. The only problem with the word embezzle is it wasn't even a word until the 18th century. It originates from the Anglo-Saxon, French, and late Middle English, and it makes the events in Luke 16 unjust from God's standards. So those are a bit of information about the word embezzle. My question to you is, how can something be a crime if the word for the crime didn't exist until 1,800 years after the event in question? It can't. But it can be a crime under God's law. When his commandment is thou shalt not steal, it's obvious. Thou shalt not steal. Just because something is right or wrong in a world's law doesn't justify it or disjustify it, if I can use that word. It may not even be a word in God's law. So let's wrap this up. I could ask you, is the master innocent? Yes, but he hired an untrustworthy steward. He didn't fire the steward until after accusations were made against him. And basically, Jesus pointed out a connection between the master and steward's contentness with unrighteousness by the master's willingness to commend the steward. But that doesn't excuse the steward's actions specifically, and that's the whole point of the story. So our three main takeaways: the steward was certainly guilty, but he also served an imperfect master. What Jesus offers us is a chance to turn away from sin and serve the perfect master, the perfect or master financial advisor, if you will. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.